And by the way, if you want to talk frankly, I'd rather get a glass of wine and wander around and we can talk that way if you want. But if there's specific questions.
I just have one really general one, which is at the beginning, Laruelle mentions that philosophy should be at the service of the human, not the human at the service of philosophy. A lot of philosophers already fall into that mode, some don't. I was curious if he or you had any specific examples of the latter category. Two came to mind for me, but I was kind of curious for them.
That come into what category?
Of those who put the human in the service of philosophy.
So the human at the service of philosophy.
So in other words, opposed to his project.
His project. Yeah, like Machiavelli, maybe. It's one that I think of, using philosophy to control humans or how in political ways. That's one that just comes off in my head. I think for him, more than anything, it's not one particular philosopher as such or a philosophy, but it's how philosophy and even thinking that what is man already has made a decision on how they're going to start that sort of journey of what man is, forgetting that we are the human, men and women, without taking into consideration that we already have a lived experience, and that's really important for him, that we inherently sort of know it's not a learned sort of thing, and that philosophy in trying to provide these sort of answers that are sufficient or desired, for example. For humans, we understand our relationships based around desire, but when you focus the attention on purely on what desire is, then you're forgetting that ideal labels of what people are. Essentially, you're getting away from what we do in the last instance always. You're always somewhere else. You're not really dealing with what's going on right now. So, it could be any sort of philosophy. It could be deconstruct, it could be any, I think for him it could be any sort of philosophy you want. It could be any sort of mysticism that could end up being not liberating the human, but enslaving them. So it could even be, for example, let's think of it. Think of any sort of.
The two that came to mind for me, and the reason for them, the one was, Ray Grasse talks about philosophy as the organon of extinction.
Okay.
And this idea that you need to reckon with the terms of, being concerned about tomorrow isn't really a philosophical question the same way that the collapse of the earth into the sun is. And then in a similar vein, Thomas Ligotti writes about his consciousness as malignantly useless, and his philosophy is organized around the self destruction of basic conscious life, reason, and all of that. So like that, those are very explicitly almost anti-human.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I think when your focus is on those sort of ideas, which is the philosophy of consciousness, for example, period, just straight up, which can be really interesting. At the end of the day, that can be great, but if you're using that to then do something much greater that has nothing to do with regular people, how they survive, things like this. I think for Laruelle at least, that's where philosophy sort of lost maybe its way. I don't know. That's a good question because it can be anything. I think maybe another example is art. You can put in a lot of different sort of things. Art at the service of the human, as a source of humans at the service of art. And so for him, it's about underdetermining these things, underdetermining philosophy, not giving it this sort of big place in the world, but using it in everyday ways. So art, for example, there's the art world, there's art with the big capital A, and it puts a lot of people are at the service of art with the capital A. But how do you underdetermine art so the average person, who are artists too, every one of us makes things. I made a sandwich yesterday. That's totally underdetermining art, right? But how do you, this is a really ridiculous example, but how do you underdetermine these things so they don't become monolithic and put them back at the service of the human and the everyday, and what he calls the ordinary man? But it's always in the last instance. So, it's not degrading art or philosophy. And again, he's not about saying get rid of philosophy. He's saying how do we rein it in a way? How do we get back? In a way, it's about getting back to these disciplines. His non-aesthetics is not about getting rid of aesthetics. It's about trying to free up new ways of thinking the relationship of art and humans. And so for him, typically there, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, it's about not letting philosophy have the upper hand when you talk about art. And that's typically what aesthetics does. It lets philosophy have the upper hand. Or art, when it tries to talk about itself, has to use philosophy to do that. And for Laruelle, he's saying, can't we think new ways to do that? What did Cubism do? What did abstract art do? They gave us different ways of seeing the world. And he's saying that philosophy's maybe perhaps lost that position of letting us see it in different ways. And so again, his science, I think, is again, maybe he did a poor job in the beginning, is about seeing or grasping things in the last instance in a different way. So what is it, so in this case, it was trying to see what a non-workshop is. But I didn't know what a non-workshop is. I might have a better idea now. But it's a way of trying to see differently and essentially to defend the human. And again, for him, we don't know what the human is, but I think we're all human. So at the same time, it's about not trying to close off and have a clear idea of what things are. And this is what philosophy struggles with a lot. And in some ways, I think what he's doing is very akin to what we know as French theory is. Okay? A lot of the French theorists were trying to get away from classical ideas of metaphysics. And they were trying, in case of deconstruction, Derrida says il n'y a pas hors texte. There's nothing outside the text. And so for Derrida, it became this idea of looking at seeing the world through narratives. And then deconstructing narratives to look at it again in a different way. And I think for a long time, Laruelle was a big fan of that sort of thing. But again, he even that he can become its own sort of self-reflective, vicious circle. And for him, it's about philosophy getting caught in these sort of vicious circles. And so, again, at the end, it's about a love for him and not philosophy, but the love of philosophy, but trying to have the human in defense in the last instance. And so for him, it's about figuring out new ways of liberating philosophy and using it as a material for other ways of thinking. And so when we talk about non-photography, for him to think of a non-aesthetics, he's trying to think of new ways of looking at photography that wouldn't be this way where we think about photography in this philosophical way where we revert back to iconography or the image or the double, which is going back to old ways of looking at philosophy. But look at photography in this sense as a new scientific way of thinking. It's a new way of thinking. And most people don't think of photography as a way to think. And I think that's what he's trying to do. And that's also where the science comes in, which is ways of looking that perhaps you see the world differently. And you can see it differently if you can try to maybe apply his practice. But again, it's a theoretical, poetic sort of practice, and it's always in the last instance, and there are as many non-philosophers as there are non-philosophies. So that's where it gets really, really tricky. And I have some other answers that he gave me, but I think I'll probably share them later. And anyway, it'll be a different non-philosophy next time. Other questions? Yeah?
Let's just kind of go back to the start. And the prefix non, he uses that quite a bit. And it seems like it's just like this underlying meta language. I'm wondering, is that based in translation from his French work, or why doesn't he use like other prefixes like anti or un or trans, or that sort of thing in defining defining his work?
I should mention too, and I didn't, because he would have been here till 2 in the morning if I would have really given an in-depth trajectory of his work. What he now calls non-philosophy is non-standard philosophy. And he did this because of the misunderstanding of the non-philosophy. For him, again, it's a mutation of philosophy. It's not anti. It's a love of philosophy, but underdetermining it and letting it mutate to open up a new space for thinking, using philosophy as material. So philosophy is used, it's there, and it's not an anti thing. You know, one of our books, Baudrillard, we call him an anti-philosopher. People have called him that. I think that makes more sense for Baudrillard because he doesn't care. I mean, I'm going to speak candid on that. I don't think he has the same relationship to philosophy that Laruelle does. He's trying to think in a theoretical way. It's a novel, sort of fictional way, and there's some similarities there, I think. But in his way, he's trying to get away from philosophy, whereas Laruelle's not. And that's a misconception. He needs philosophy, but it's a science of and for philosophy, which is very important to have of and for him. So that is I think the way why he'll stick to the non, and even when he changed it to non-standard, it was to separate him from thinkers like Deleuze and Derrida, which he calls standard philosophers. He has a great debt to Deleuze. And when I asked him about his influences as a thinker, and I said, you know, when I read your work, like, he doesn't cite many people, but I said, you know, I see an awful lot of similarities in your play. He's a jokester between Derrida and Deleuze. It's pretty, like, to me, it seemed pretty clear. And of course, I'm a big fan of Deleuze and Derrida's work. So maybe it was a little bit of my own projection. But I asked him this, and he does cite them a little. And he said, yes, you know, I have a great admiration for Deleuze. And again, as I mentioned, Deleuze has a nice footnote for him at the end of Deleuze's career, as when he talks about what philosophy is and what it is he did his entire life. And when he does that, and it's sort of an overview and looking back on what he did, and then in the same moment says, well, this guy, though, that guy's doing something interesting we need to look at. And it's a science of non-philosophy. And they exchange letters. And one of the questions was from Deleuze, and this will come out in the book in a couple of months, this letter that I looked at, was what is the difference between your concept of the one, or the real, in the last instance, and Spinoza's concept of substance? And Laruelle replied in the same way that Spinoza wrote his Scholias. And it was 1.1. What I mean by the one in the last instance is this. And 1.2. What I mean by this is this. And he totally mimics and parodies Spinoza. And I asked him, I said, I thought that was really funny. And I asked him, I said, you know, are you a non-Spinoza? Would you be cool with that? You call him that? And he said, you know, I'm going back to Spinoza too. And he said, I don't want a misunderstanding. I have a great respect for Deleuze, and you know, in some ways, I think he was candid and he didn't want to. He was nice in his gestures towards me, but I think as Deleuze and Derrida both thought that, oh, in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, oh, he's doing the same thing I am. This is a constant problem in philosophy. That's a longer story that I can get into, because then it gets into this idea of victims. And so for Laruelle too, there's this sort of constant crime scene. You could look at the history of philosophy as one big crime scene, which is weird. But if you do it, you realize somebody is like this guy, and then they sort of stab him in the back, and then you know, it's either Hegel or Spinoza.